and welcome to The World This Week. For the next 40 minutes, my very talkative journalist and I will be dissecting and analysing the major news events of the past 7 days. And there's a lot to get through tonight, so let me introduce tonight's guest. Alison Smale is executive editor of the International Herald Tribune. Philip Turle is an editor at RFI. David Clarke is deputy bureau chief at AFP, and Celestine Bolen is a freelance journalist. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us tonight. Now, this programme is brought to you in conjunction with the International Herald Tribune. Now, first up, two dictators under pressure this week. Rebels in Libya saying that Colonel Gaddafi will be gone within a fortnight after they claim to have seized a key town just miles from Tripoli. Meanwhile, for the first time, the United States and its allies have called directly for Syria's President Bashar al-Assad to step aside. Well, this more than 5 months after the uprising began, almost 2,000 people are thought to have been killed in the crackdown. Yesterday, the United Nations said the regime was guilty of human rights abuses. Hillary Clinton said enough was enough.
The Assad government has now been condemned by countries in all parts of the world and can look only to Iran for support for its brutal and unjust crackdown. This morning, President Obama called on Assad to step aside and announced the strongest set of sanctions to date targeting the Syrian government. These sanctions include the energy sector to increase pressure on the regime. The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
All right, Celestine Bolen, we heard some of the sanctions the US will impose on Syria there. Is it enough to stop President al-Assad from killing his own people?
I mean, I think all of this is, sort of a well-orchestrated international effort, which is good. It's come, particularly because it's people coming together. And as she said in her statement, that the fact that Turkey and some of the Arab countries are also backing this kind of, perhaps not explicitly, but the tough talk. Sanctions, I mean, I don't know. Honestly, Syria doesn't actually export much oil. They have a big, the big port through which oil is exported. I think it's more sort of words and sounding tough than anything that's going to really change his mind. I think that the big question is, in all of this, what effect will it have? And I fear perhaps not much.
David Clarke, the big hope here by the US and its allies is that the elites in Syria, where we haven't seen protests in cities like Damascus and Aleppo as much as we have done elsewhere, the hope is that they will now turn against Assad when they start to see their fortunes hit as well.
If that's the hope, then people must have been hoping before or believing before that they hadn't got the message, that people were upset by what's going on there. I think when Assad looks at the images we're seeing of tens of thousands of people in his own streets, that's going to be more important to him than hearing that Hillary Clinton wants to sequestrate his assets. I honestly don't think this is what he'd be worried about. He might be worried about what the Turks think. The Turks are very annoyed about the refugees coming over their border, and historically Erdogan's been quite close to Assad, although even there he's come quite close to burning his bridges. And it doesn't look like the people on the Security Council are going to be united about any stronger sanctions than this. The Human Rights Commissioner Navi Pillay briefed them on Thursday that she thought that the International Criminal Court should be brought in. She thought there's prima facie evidence that there's a shoot-to-kill policy against the crowds. But she said herself when she left the room, she didn't feel that the Security Council members were ready to take that step. So there's still incremental diplomatic things we can do to threaten him. But I think the life-or-death battle now is on the streets of Daraa and Al-Fakir and Homs.
Alison, there's not a great deal more the international community can viably do at this stage.
Well, as Dave rightly intimates, the Security Council could come together more, and as Celestine has pointed out, the advantage of yesterday's action was that it was the United States acting in concert with Britain, France, Germany, Canada, a certain degree of international solidarity, and the European Union, absolutely. But, I mean, there is a question mark over how far Russia will ever go to sort of let go of its, for Moscow, valuable partnership with Syria. There's a question as how much China ever will condone sort of international interference in another country. So the pressure is clearly there, but what the decisive factor will be, it'll be inside the country. And Bashar al-Assad is a member of the Alawite minority. His family has strong control through the security network. And the question is, are there enough people with them to keep the place in order and functioning or not? And we haven't yet seen evidence that that control is completely crumbling. I mean, it's very clear that control has been lost in some towns and that there's a lot of resistance. But it's not clear at all that there is sufficient sort of weakness within to bring this government down.
Do you think Assad will be concerned about the sanctions and the pressure that's mounting? And as we've been saying, Russia's position is still key, isn't it?
Well, Russia's already said that it wants to give him more time to come up with reforms. It'd be quite interesting to know how much time they want to give him, because he's had quite a few months already. The Chinese position is also an interesting one, and that's one of the keys to this coming to a head at some point or not. I think obviously Assad is worried about that, but there are other factors which I think probably he's more worried about at the moment. The first one is, will the army remain under his control or not? Will there be a split within the army between those who will join forces with the insurgents and desert Assad and his family? That's one thing to be worried about. The second thing, which I think obviously he'll be very worried about, will be the state of the economy in Syria. If the sanctions do begin to bite, then the United States has said it's not going to import oil from Syria. It's a very minute amount of oil which is imported into the United States, which won't have much of an effect on the imports of oil. It's a symbolic thing, but it will bite harder in Syria than it will affect the United States if they decide not to import Syrian oil. So it will be more important within Syria. And the third thing, as Alison was correctly saying, is how much longer will the Alawites in Syria continue to support Assad, and how much longer will it be before that support will begin to crumble? Those are the key issues, I think, that concern the future of Assad and his ability to stay in power, much more than the international community, because if there's going to be a resolution from the Security Council, there's going to have to be many more countries brought on board before we're anywhere close to a resolution, which will be much more difficult for him to overcome.
I just was the details today of the fighting in Daraa were interesting because apparently among the, I don't know, half a dozen dead were 5 soldiers who were killed because they refused to fire on the crowd. And I just feel, I mean, that's tiny.
Well, we've been hearing quite a lot of that, haven't we? Of the brutal tactics within the army. And a lot of the casualties, of course, have been soldiers.
Right.
But al-Assad's response to the United Nations, of course, has been, look, the crackdown's not happening anymore.
Yes, although the human rights groups still report many dead, despite the fact that the crackdown has stopped. Gaddafi announced 2 or 3 times that he was stopping the crackdown in and around Benghazi before the rebellion properly got underway there. And we haven't had a successful outcome yet in Libya. So that's the people of the Middle East must be looking at the chaos in Libya and the chaos that we had in Iraq before, and wondering what happens next in a country the size of Syria. And as to sanctions on oil, we had oil for food sanctions against Saddam Hussein for over a decade, and it did not budge him at all. The Alawite clan around Assad are very much involved in business, and so in a sense these sanctions could hurt their personal wealth. But historically, what's happened when sanctions have been imposed on a country, a certain elite, especially an elite that's got business and military interests like this one, can start smuggling, and they can then the people start to suffer more, but the elite starts to prosper.
Everything just goes on the black
There'll
market.
be fleets of trucks driving across the
problem is that they've got both sides have gone too far. If the protesters give in, then they face being crushed by the regime, and there could be a terrible amount of bloodletting. If the regime gives in, then it's going to obviously let the protesters and the situation spiral out of control, and their days will be even more numbered than they are already. So neither side can afford to give in.
And we seem a long way from
negotiations.
finding a solution.
The difficulty is to have any kind of orderly, quote unquote, outcome. I think that's going to be extremely difficult.
All right, well, let's move on to Libya. You've all mentioned it, because on Gaddafi, Washington said this week that the dictator's days were numbered. This after rebels claimed to have seized Zawiya, a town just 30 miles from the capital and one of the last oil refineries under Gaddafi's control. A game changer for sure, But are we near the end game in Libya after months of NATO airstrikes? Philip, are we anywhere near the beginning of the end, as it's been called for the last few months?
I think we are. I mean, I don't think anybody should stick their neck out and say, yes, it's going to be over by the end of August, because you never know. I mean, Gaddafi, I don't think, is going to sort of stand down. And any efforts that have been made up until now to try to negotiate with him have always ended with him calling people all sorts of names and refusing to stand down and saying, I'm going to stay in charge until forever. So I think there's obviously growing worry in Tripoli that the capture of this oil refinery and the cutting off of this main road into Tripoli, which has been their main supply route, is obviously going to make things a lot more difficult. But while Gaddafi stays in power, I don't think that it's a wise idea to say by the end of August he'll be out. He may be, but he may well not be. He's a man who has a lot of resources. He's a man, as we know, for the last few months, is not going to stand down. It's not going to have a negotiated way out, although there are reports that there are negotiations taking place between the United States, between the rebels and between maybe the European Union about trying to find a way out of this, and between Gaddafi's forces saying, OK, one of the agreements that we're going to have is that he will be given safe passage out of the country and no charges will be pressed against him. Depends whether or not Gaddafi is going to agree to that. And I think Gaddafi is a man who's going to want to stay right to the end.
Right, and we're hearing he might end up in Venezuela. But there is a big worry, isn't there, that he might release something awful like chemical weapons or something if he is backed into a corner. That's the big fear now, isn't it?
I mean, I think there is a fear of that. What I haven't seen, and it's not all that surprising by anybody sort of claiming that, is any credible breakdown of what kind of weapons is he really supposed to have at his disposal at this stage, and how accurate a tally do we really have on the outside, because we know that he renounced nuclear weapons and resumed ties with the United States and the rest of the West a few years ago. Presumably that was verifiable, and presumably we got some idea of what else he might have had at his disposal. So I think we have to. We're not quite sure, does he really have the goods here or not? Negotiating with him, it seems to me, is like trying to sort of take handfuls of sand and keep them in your hand. It's very difficult. Sorry.
One of the weapons that he agreed to dismantle as part of that agreement was his Scud ballistic missiles. Yes. And he fired one this week.
Just a few days ago.
Apparently he agreed to dismantle them, and then there was a disagreement about whether he could keep them until he found a replacement, which strikes me as a strange kind of disarmament policy. But in any case, I wouldn't worry too much about the Scud missiles, because they're kind of... Has anyone ever died from a Scud missile attack?
Well, they said that's a sign of his
one of the worst
desperation.
weapons in the history of the world.
I mean, some said
it hit the desert. I could hit the desert in Libya.
Didn't Saddam send them into Israel?
Yeah, some people choked to death in Israel because they didn't understand how to operate their gas masks.
Yeah. And there's another concern, isn't there? Because
2 or 3.
As the rebels are united for now in their aim to unseat Gaddafi, but the big fear is what will happen once Gaddafi goes. Will they stay together? And we don't know what kind of elements are within the rebel groups. Anyway, do we?
No, and I mean, I think, when we say the beginning of the end or the end game, I mean, the problem is it isn't an end. There won't be an end, just even when he leaves. I mean, there's a very high probability of a civil war in other forms, perhaps less, perhaps more sort of scattered, whatever. And the same with Syria. I mean, I think that there's just sort of no... that's the problem with this whole will this be effective question. Well, the answer is yes, let's just say it is effective, but that's not the result it's not going to bring about the result that we would all be happy to see, which would be a safe, democratic orderly, transition, clean, sort of assumption of responsibility in a geopolitical sense, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the problem is this mess will be followed by more mess.
Well, right, and I put that point to a rebel earlier this week, and he was very upset. He says, look, we're not Iraq and we're not Somalia. Trust us, we can run our own country. We just need the chance to do it. We've lived under Gaddafi for so long. All we want now is to try and have a democracy. So,
I think that... there's going to be a period of turmoil once this is over, unlike I think there will be in Syria if Assad is ousted, because you have to remember these people have lived under this dictatorship for so long, in the case of Gaddafi for over 42 years. And obviously all opposition has been shut up in that time. There's been no freedom of speech, nothing. So the day that all of that is taken off, it's like a pressure cooker coming undone and everything exploding. So there's obviously going to be some infighting about who's going to have control and who isn't.
Because there's a lot at stake,
and how that's going to be organised and whether we're going to have democratic elections.
There are loyalists. I mean, there are loyalists of, Gaddafi. I mean,
of course, who are going to have to have their say as well. So
And
what
they're
the thing is,
also,
the most important thing is we hear all the time about this is what's going on in Libya, this is what's going on in Syria, but there's not an awful lot of discussion about, well, if it comes to an end, what's going to happen afterwards? What role is the international community going to play? How is
What
the
can it
international
play?
community going to make sure that this doesn't spiral out of control into a terrible civil war that's going to drag on for years? We might end up in a situation like Iraq or even, God forbid, Afghanistan. So we're going to have to make sure that something follows on that's going to create some kind of system that's going to be able to keep the country in order. And that I think is the big challenge which is going to face the international community. And that is the big question that no one really can answer for the moment.
There was a story in the London Times this week quoting a NATO official saying that what they feared now was catastrophic success. That but when Zawiya fell, they suddenly realised Tripoli might actually fall to this ragtag bunch of lunatics. And then what do we do? The point of the air operation, it seems to me, was to stop Gaddafi murdering the opposition. It wasn't to help the opposition get to the gates of Tripoli like
kind
this.
of morphed, didn't it? I mean,
Yes.
suddenly he has to go, and so it was
I
more
don't think everybody in NATO is on board with that plan. And already the post-revolutionary bloodletting has begun. The commander of rebel forces was killed by rebel forces.
Yeah.
And the good people who are fighting to defend Misrata say they're not taking orders from Benghazi. A lot of the people fighting down from the Jebel Nafusa mountains are Berbers. Now, they say that a lot to Libya, but it's also the first time they've had to express their own culture. They've started their own radio station. They're putting up posters in their own Berber language. Now, that's fantastic, and it's great that they're getting to express themselves, but they haven't
Then they have to
fitted into the Libyan political system before, and some way will have to be found for them to express their culture democratically.
And that even also has knock-on effects because of Algeria and Morocco. So it's everything is very fluid, and as we saw with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Soviet bloc, once you sort of lift a kind of iron framework that has kept things solidified and in place, if you lift it off, I mean, it's very much more difficult to find new directions for things to go in, which doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't wish for a good outcome where people do feel safer and freer and more secure. But it's going to be extremely difficult. And really, the international community at the moment is so worried with its own financial markets and masses of other issues. It's hard to imagine that a lot of attention is being paid.
All right, and financial markets are exactly what we will be talking about in just a few moments. Stay tuned, we'll have the second part of tonight's debate after another very choppy week on the markets, up and down, the worst volatility and the worst one-day sell-off, in fact, since 2008. We'll be talking more about that, and we'll be talking about Egypt as well. Join us in a few moments.